Hi, today's topic was suggested by Who's. In a recent video, I mentioned that I'm currently preparing to run Cortex Prime for the first time at BSer Con. Who's suggested that I talk about my Cortex Prime prep process and debrief on how the session went and what I learned from it. But first, recent reflections. I want to do a brief recap of BSer Con 2, which happened just last weekend. BSer Con is an online convention organized by Sean from the Gaming and BS podcast. The actual podcast ended last year, but the community is thriving with a very active Discord server. We had the first BSer Con last year, and since it was so successful, we decided to have it again this year. I ran 2 games, Warpstar and Cortex Prime. I really enjoyed running Warpstar, like I knew I would. It's the same system as Warlock, but reskinned for sci-fi, which means different skills, careers, and a few new rules, such as spaceship combat. I got feedback from one player that the roles felt a bit difficult, which is fair, although somewhat intended. I could probably set better expectations, as the game is expected to be fairly gritty and not super heroic. And I might consider giving more situational bonuses when appropriate. But there were also many situations where I either didn't even call for a roll because their stats would make it an obvious success, or others where failure didn't mean that their character couldn't pull off what they were trying to accomplish, but simply that it would take a bit longer, which in turn created interesting complications. For example, they had to fend off enemies while trying to boot up a damaged computer. Overall, I thought it was a very fun session, and I want to run more Warpstar for sure. And of course, I ran Cortex Prime, which I will discuss in the main topic. I also played 3 games. The first was Fate, Uranium Chef. This was a bit of a zany mix of Iron Chef meets sci-fi comedy. It's surprisingly crunchy for Fate, and there's lots of stuff to track, especially for the GM. The adventure was way too long, even after some cuts that Roger already made, which is a bit odd. It feels like the kind of wacky setting that really works best as a one-shot, maybe 2 sessions, but it's too long and complex for that. Still, it was great fun, the players were awesome, and Roger really did a great job running it. The second game was Tales from the Loop. Ange ran this one, and this is a system that I had been wanting to play for a while, and I know many people that have praised it for years. It's lots of fun. I love the 80s. And while I don't normally gravitate towards games where you play kids, every once in a while that's fine. Tales from the Loop puts a nice spin on it, with its mix of 80s kids on bike action and weird science. The homebrew adventure that Ange ran was great, and the players really leaned into it as well. Last not least, we played Barbarians of Lemuria. Paragon ran this game. This was sword and sorcery, which is one of my favorite fantasy subgenres. It's super fun. Paragon really brought the sword and sorcery vibe alive. The players were great. We hit many tropes of the genre, such as avenging a brutal death, defeating an army of soldiers, there was a strenuous ship journey, and rescuing a friend from an evil cult. The system felt pretty lightweight, but with plenty of depth. I would definitely play this again. And of course, we had some hangouts as well, just chatting casually with other BSers. It was a great weekend, but I was pretty wiped out afterwards. I'm realizing that I really can't play more than 2 sessions per day online. I can play more in person, but online, 2 is my max. Looking very much forward to the next one, which Sean already scheduled for January 2024. Let's move on to the main topic, Cortex Prime. First, a bit of an introduction to those not familiar with the game. This was a Kickstarter from April 2017, which delivered in late 2020. The game builds itself as a multi-genre modular role-playing game. It's a new system based on the rule set from prior Cortex systems, such as Marvel Heroic, Leverage, Supernatural, Smallville, Firefly, and others. Here's an excerpt of the description on the website. What is Cortex Prime? Imagine a world-building tabletop RPG system where you and your players choose the genre, build the game, and forge the story from a set of modular rules mechanics. Cortex Prime helps you create a one-of-a-kind experience tailored to the way you and your friends like to play to bring to life an experience you will never forget. You can read the rest yourself over at cortexrpg.com. I do want to call out another thing that's nice about Cortex Prime. In addition to print and PDF, they have the whole content of the book online on a nice searchable website. This is really well done and great to read on the phone as well. All games should have this, frankly. So, what attracted me to Cortex Prime in the first place? Well, it seems great for realizing my own homebrew setting ideas. It strikes a good middle ground between using an existing system and building a completely custom system from scratch. It's a toolkit that provides rules and guidance for trait sets and mods. I'll give some concrete examples later when I describe my setting. You mix and match these modular rules to realize the desired mechanics and vibe for your game. Many people might put Cortex Prime into a similar bucket as generic systems like Savage Worlds or Fate. I've run both of those systems as well, and they're great games in their own right, but there are some fundamental differences between generic systems and toolkits like Cortex Prime. An advantage of generic game systems is that they're much easier to get to the table. While you may need to do a bit of tuning for a homebrew setting, the rules are mostly fixed. And once you've used them with one setting, it's pretty easy to use them again with another setting. The flip side of that is that generic systems tend to feel mostly the same, regardless of setting. For example, Savage Worlds does pulp adventures amazingly well, but it's hard to take the pulp out of the system. In contrast, Cortex Prime requires a fair amount of upfront work for each individual setting you want to run. But as a result, each game will feel very different, depending on the mods and trait sets you choose to use. There isn't even a standard way to create Cortex Prime characters. Depending on the game, you might provide archetypes as quick and easy starting points. You might create characters completely from scratch by distributing trait values based on rules you provide. Or you might use the highly collaborative pathways method to create your setting, characters, and their relationships as a group. Let's talk about getting it to the table. This was quite different from my regular approach that I outlined in a recent video about how I evaluate and learn new RPGs. Simply taking a pass or two through the book, creating a sample character, and trying out the dice mechanics wouldn't cut it in this case. I should note that I had never played any previous Cortex games, such as Firefly, Battlestar Galactica, Smallville, Marvel Heroic, Leverage, etc. This was one of those Kickstarters that delivered several years after it was originally planned. Instead of 1 year, it took 3.5 years. So I was a bit lukewarm on it at first after it delivered, but it still managed to pique my interest once I started reading it. I quickly realized that there was something super elegant about the core mechanic, and the overall toolkit-like premise really resonated with me. But it also meant that I couldn't simply read it once or twice and then run it. I first had to figure out a setting, come up with the right trait sets and mods, and that was difficult because of my lack of experience with the system. And frankly, the book didn't make it easy to understand when I might want to use certain mods. I ended up putting it aside and picking it back up a few times over the course of almost 2 years. I also spent a ton of time on the Discord server, on Reddit, and other places. Discord in particular was very helpful. Cam himself often chimes in, and many other experienced players and Cortex game designers as well. I also got into 2 one-shots to experience at least the player side of Cortex Prime. I could have run one of the example settings that came with the book, but none of them really resonated with me, to be honest. Another thing that made it harder to learn is that there's a relative small online presence for Cortex Prime. There are no significant forums or user groups, aside from the Discord and subreddit I mentioned above. Since I am a bit of a collector, I also bought a bunch of the older Cortex games. There was another challenge here. These games were all based on licenses, all of which had expired, so the books were out of print, but I still managed to track down copies of the books I cared about. Flipping through those helped me understand some of the rules, as well as providing inspiration for handling certain things, such as ships. As a side note, I'm generally not a fan of licensed settings, and I wish that Cortex leaned more into their own custom settings instead. The only official Cortex Prime game right now is Tales of Xadia, which is also licensed, based on a TV show. Why don't I like licensed settings? Well, there's the reason I mentioned above. Licenses eventually expire, which leads to orphaned games. But I also tend to be overwhelmed by the lore. While I love the vibe of movies, TV shows, or books, I'm not good at remembering the details. So I prefer settings that perhaps borrow the vibe of those properties, but not the actual lore. Once I had a high-level grasp on the system, I had to decide on a setting and start putting together my hack. I decided that I want to run a pirate-themed game where those at sea are the only people that have escaped the zombie apocalypse. I'm tentatively calling it Zombies of the Caribbean. Here's what my character sheet looks like, which I made in Google Sheets. I'm showing a mostly complete pre-gen for a swashbuckler. Cortex has a notion of trait sets, which can be attributes, skills, or even things like values or relationships, depending on what your game is about. Traits are rated in die sizes, anywhere from D4 to D12. Whenever you make a die roll, you assemble a dice pool by taking one die from each of the main trait sets, typically 3, and any other traits that might apply to the situation. I try to flavor the names of my traits according to the pirate genre. I'm using attributes, daring, flair, savvy, and vigor. Those are about how your character behaves. I'm also using roles: carpenter, commander, fighter, sailor, and surgeon. You can think of these kind of like skills, but broader, and they're not mutually exclusive. For example, our swashbuckler here is a great fighter, rated at D10, but his D8 commander role would mean that he's also pretty good at getting people to listen to him. And like any Cortex Prime game, you have distinctions. With distinctions, you generally want them to be able to work either in your favor or occasionally against you. For example, there's a hinder mechanic that allows players to decide that their distinction should act against them on a particular role, and in return, they get a plot point. In my game, I chose to make one of the distinctions about their approach or attitude, one about their pirate life, and one about a quirk. In case of our swashbuckler, you see that they are a dashing swashbuckler. It looks like they are dreaming of having their own ship one day. And with their quirk, it looks like they can talk themselves out of trouble, but also get themselves into trouble just as often. Special effects are essentially advantages that players can unlock over time. I went with pre-written special effects to keep it simple, similar to hammerheads from the core book. Although I would let players swap these out further down the line in a longer campaign. Some of these allow players to spend a plot point in order to improve their dice rolls. Others allow them to create assets, or maybe even gain plot points by leaning into their quirk. Sort of like a self-compel in Fate, if you're familiar with that game. Finally, I'm using stress and trauma. Stress itself is a mod, although a very common one. It either completely replaces or coexists with a default conditions mechanic. It gives you a stress track that you might know from various other games. I considered using the Shaken and Stricken mod, which applies directly to attributes. But I dismissed it as it creates an intense death spiral, and I wanted a more pulpy feel for my setting. I went with trauma as a good middle ground. Trauma represents lasting consequences that characters need to spend time recovering from. It can provide fodder for entire improv sessions, but without completely crippling the character's actions. This is a good example of the kind of fine-tuning that you can achieve with Cortex Prime compared to generic systems. I also used the simplified stress rule from Tales of Xadia. Cortex Prime has a slightly weird special case when stress drops to a D4. There's lots of discussion about this on the Cortex Prime Discord, and even Cam admits that this rule is a bit awkward, so he simplified it for Tales of Xadia and I thought it fits very well into my own game as well. Ships work similar to characters in my game, but notably without roles. I used a mix of vehicle rules from the Cortex Prime book, with some inspiration from previous Cortex books. In particular, in Firefly, spaceships have attributes and distinctions, but crew members use their own skills when operating the spaceship. So I'm doing the same here, with characters using their own role trait. Let's talk about the rules and mods I chose. I already mentioned stress and trauma earlier. I fretted a lot over whether to use tests and contests versus action-based resolution, and I still kind of do. This is something that Cortex Prime doesn't handle well, in my opinion. The idea is to pick one approach and stick with it, but I really like the elegance of tests and contests for most things, yet want to be able to handle certain encounters by taking turns more dramatically. Action-based resolution does that, but it's just different enough from tests and contests, in particular who rolls first, using action and reaction versus rolling the difficulty first and then rolling against it, that it feels like it would be awkward to spring both approaches on players, especially those themselves new to Cortex. I might still use action-based resolution in the future, but I decided to mostly just use tests, and I also stole challenges from Tales of Xadia. Challenges are a really important addition in my opinion, and I'm planning to mostly rely on these versus building complex NPCs, aka GMCs in Cortex Prime. In my opinion, challenges fill a critical gap in the original book, even if they're similar to crisis pools from Hammerheads. Finally, I'm using the limited Doom pool. I'm not going to discuss the difference between the limited and regular Doom pool in detail here, but primarily the limited Doom pool replaces plot points for the Game Master. It grows in certain situations, for example when players roll hitches, ones on their dice. And it can be used for anything that plot points can do. Plot points are Cortex Prime's regular meta currency for both players and Game Masters. But GMs can also add dice from their limited Doom pool to their dice pools to increase the difficulty on certain rolls when dramatically appropriate. So this felt like a nice way to ramp up the tension over the course of the game. I also had to figure out how to play Cortex Prime online. This requires a bit more thought than for many other games. They are working on official digital tools, which have been in progress for a while. Character sheets and dice rolling is already supported for Tales of Xadia, but that doesn't help custom Cortex Prime games like this one. Cortex Prime really needs this. It will be awesome for creators when they can create games online by easily picking and choosing trait sets, mods, etc., and having the system generate a character sheet and handle rolls. In an ideal world, I could even envision a wizard-like UI that walks GMs through the game creation process and suggests the appropriate trait sets and mods to use based on their goals for the game. But there's no ETA for these tools right now. With Direwolf's acquisition of Cortex Prime last year, all bets are off. But they do have good experience in the digital space, so fingers crossed. Then there are traditional virtual tabletops, such as Foundry. Foundry in particular seems to have pretty solid support for Cortex Prime. I've heard good things about it. It's worth checking out, especially if you're already using Foundry. I'm not sure about other VTT's support for Cortex Prime, like Roll20 or Fantasy Grounds. It's a bit overkill for the experience I wanted in my game, though. As someone who tends to prefer theater of the mind, I usually don't need a full-blown VTT. I generally like using Google Sheets for character sheets when playing online. I'm not a visual artist, but I'm happy with the one I came up with. I'm able to lay it out like I want, and use some fun colors to make things pop. Discord is my application of choice for video and voice, and it has great dice bots as well. Because of the way Cortex Prime's dice pools work though, most dice bots don't work well. Luckily, there's a Cortex-specific dice bot that works great. Cortex Pal 2000. So that's what I used for my game, and the feedback was very positive. I know at least one person that's working on a slightly more sophisticated bot, which I might try in the future. Aside from the rules, I also had to come up with the content for my setting and adventure. so I browsed pirate and zombie-related pages on TV tropes. Cortex as a system is straightforward enough that I don't really need system-specific resources. I just need the content and tropes. I also bought and skimmed a bunch of pirate and zombie RPGs. For example, Savage Worlds, Pirates of the Spanish Main has great info about the Caribbean, pirate ships, roles, and so on. I even bought my first GURPS books. I never thought that I would. But there's some nice content in those books that can be used regardless of system. I came up with a starting situation. This isn't so much a cohesive adventure, but rather a collection of scenes to play as the characters encounter zombies for the first time and deal with the fallout. And I can fast forward to the next chapter as needed. Finally, I came up with a set of world-building questions. I figured that this would help the players get invested in the game and allow me to facilitate a more engaging session by touching on their choices. There's their primary nationality, English, Spanish, French, or Dutch. They could choose whether they wanted to be privateers or pirates, where privateers are essentially pirates that have a letter of marque. They could choose the ship's name, the captain's name, and their home base. In my case, our group chose Martinique. Also, who their rival is and why they are looking for them right now. Our group came up with a really fun backstory for their captain, who ended up being chased by his own ex-wife, and their most recent adventure and the most valuable haul they obtained. Let's talk a bit about how the actual game went and what my learnings are. I was admittedly nervous leading up to it. I frequently run new game systems, but this one was somehow more intimidating for me. I kept second-guessing my mods choices right up to the game, but it went really well overall. I was lucky to have a great set of players. I was upfront about expecting some rough edges, and they were understanding and really leaned into the setting and rolled with it. I think everybody had fun with the setting, but I realized afterwards that I missed some opportunities to let the players discover the cause of the zombie apocalypse. I'll have to work some of those elements in the next time I run the game. The trait sets for characters and ships seem great. The mods and other tweaks seem good as well. The players really liked how I ran ship combat. Using the challenge mechanic, where players take turns followed by the enemy ship, worked well. The players use the ship's attributes, but their own role. I did realize that I have to be flexible about letting them use their own traits, as opposed to the ships for some actions. For example, one player tried persuading the captain to take a certain course of action. This was more about them than the ship. I also need to tune my challenges a bit. Maybe dial in the size of the die pool, which affects the difficulty and length of the encounter. I need to learn when to use D8s versus D10s, and how many of them. The book does have guidelines, but those only go so far. And I need to find a way to gracefully exit challenges depending on how the story evolves. But I did like the challenge rules overall. The Discord DiceBot works really well also. I got feedback that it was faster than the point-and-click interface that Roll20 provides. As for Cortex Prime itself, it's too early for me to fully assess after just one session. But I had a great time running my first game. I'm increasingly leaning into an improv GM style, and the system and setting really lends itself to that. Creating my setting was fun and rewarding, even if it felt a bit daunting. Now that I'm more comfortable with the system, creating the next setting should be a lot simpler. In many ways, this feels like a perfect option to realize my setting ideas. So it's a great addition to my RPG tool belt. I really want to play in person at some point. My sense is that Cortex Prime would really shine when sitting around the table and rolling physical dice due to the tactile nature of the system, such as picking out which dice to use for value and effect. But Discord and Google Sheets worked well overall, and online play could be even better once the official digital tools come out. I'm looking forward to more Cortex Prime in my future. Well, that's it for now. Who's, I hope I was able to address your topic suggestion. And everyone, if you've run Cortex Prime, why don't you leave a comment to share your experience with it? As always, likes and subscribes are appreciated as well. Thanks for watching, and see you next time!